I want to begin to emphasize off of this description by Jeremy Rifkin is that we are wired for sociability. We are wired for attachment. We are wired for affection. We are wired for companionship. This is an evolutionary adaptation to keep us safe. And there are huge consequences to this. One of them is the power of identity in connection, because our first drive, says Rifkin, is a drive to actually belong. It's an empathic drive. And that drive helps explain how otherwise very, very smart people behave in ways that objectively you ask, why the heck are they doing that? Why the heck are they doing that? And it's because they want to belong to the group. So, for example, as Professor Noldmeyer has pointed out, I spend my life on the road, and I had the good fortune this week to spend 3 days in northern Wisconsin, where I observed really smart people behaving in very strange ways. We have a Wisconsinite in the room. Those are your people. And there it is. Kristen has an identity connection with her people. The ones who wear cheese on their heads, or at least rubberized facsimiles of cheese, and then rub something to resemble cheese on their face. And we look at that, if we're not from Wisconsin, and say, huh?
I say huh as well.
Okay. but you don't have to be from Wisconsin. You can be from any place that has a sports franchise, and you see the same thing. But here's my favorite example of people behaving in completely bizarre ways if you don't understand their identity context. And it's this. Now, let me suggest that there was a moment in June 2007 when thousands of otherwise really smart people spent the night sleeping out on the streets of some of our larger cities, waiting to be able to buy. And let me say further that that is a phone. And let me say yet further that every single person on that line didn't need a phone. They already had a phone. If they were on that line, they already had a phone. And oh, by the way, the people who made this phone had lots of phones to sell the next day. There was no suggestion that there wouldn't be enough supply to sell the phones to people who showed up the next day. But thousands of people waited through the night to get the phone because they wanted to identify with being the first to get the phone. They wanted to say, I am so cool. I waited through the night to get this phone. And I see some people saying, leaders need to take this kind of phenomenon into account because one of the delusions of leadership is that people make rational decisions about their own self-interest. And they don't. They don't merely make rational decisions about their own self-interest. If you look at the work of George Lakoff, the cognitive linguist at Berkeley, whom we read in the strategy course and who is at Circle in the Power of Communication, he says whether it's consumers of products or consumers of entertainment or voters in elections, we make choices based on identity and emotional connection. We justify choices by reference to some fact. So you talk to anybody waiting online outside the Mac store, they'll give you all of the reasons why it's important for them to have access to the phone right away. But those are rationalizations. They're not actually reasons. They're after-the-fact explanations to make them sound more thoughtful. But this is an identity-emotion play, not a rational self-interest play. And there's nothing wrong with it being that. That's how human beings are. Maybe we were born this way. And we need to honor that this is how human beings behave. And by the time people get in positions of leadership, especially in quantitatively driven industries, they tend to scrub that out of their way of thinking. Let's move on and overlay that with the neuroscience of distraction. One of the things we know from watching human beings is that human beings have a very hard time paying attention. Especially now with devices like the very iPhone that I acquired 3 years after most people were online. Notice I kind of made the ability to say, I have a different. People have a very hard time paying attention because technology now makes it easier to not pay attention, but to do things in a different way. Especially as people become tired, especially as people become angry, especially as people become anxious, the more emotionally wrought we get or physically wrought we get, the harder it is for us to pay attention. This becomes really important to change management. It becomes really important to crisis management. But it also becomes important in product marketing because people will even pay attention to us if they're somehow emotionally or physically not optimal. But the sad reality is most human beings most of the time are not optimal. And leaders sometimes assume incorrectly that all the people they talk to are listening to them optimally. And people don't listen to others optimally. Even when the stakes are personally very high to the listener, listeners don't pay attention optimally. So for example, what we know is that when a patient gets a diagnosis from a doctor, and that's a pretty significant thing, half of what the doctor tells the patient is forgotten by the patient by the time the patient gets home. And of the half that is remembered, half of that is misremembered. So 75% of what a doctor tells a patient is either forgotten or misremembered by the time the patient gets home. Now, there are strategies for dealing with this. There are strategies for overcoming this phenomenon. One of the strategies is to have the doctor repeat it, so you hear it twice. Another strategy is to have the doctor write it down. Another strategy is to have the patient write it down. Another strategy is have the patient bring someone else into the room when getting the diagnosis. Those are all strategies to overcome this phenomenon. But this phenomenon exists, and it exists in all manner of situations. If something as important as this is so misremembered and forgotten, imagine how less important things are. So one of the things I spend a lot of time with my executive clients on is getting them to not assume that every time they open their mouth, everyone is hanging on their every word and internalizing it completely and acting on it immediately, because that's just not the way human beings are built. There's some knowing smiles around the room from people who have experienced that.